Damas and Aaron, springtime is about as good a time as any to start addressing the magnificent rivalry between New York and Boston. And no matter what side of that rivalry you're on, and you have to pick a side, you'd be hard-pressed to find another one quite as great within these United States of America, not just for its passion, but for the historical significance and longevity that this particular rivalry has encompassed. And while the Sox, or the Sox, may have us on their two most recent World Series titles, as far as my math works, 27 World Championships beats 9. But, and if you go back a little further than that, like I do, we can simply mention two names, Bill Buckner and Mookie Wilson. I'm just kidding. Anyway, while you may savor this great rivalry along with me, how far back does the spirit of that rivalry actually go? As far back as, say, the creation of Major League Baseball? Or maybe even further. Maybe that rivalry goes back as far as, say, the Stamp Act of 1765 and the competition that existed between these two developing cities and the events involving loyalists and patriots that would eventually lead to the American Revolution. Well, let me say that it actually goes back even more than 150 years before that. Yes, it does. And so I was just talking to someone the other day about how our American history is not only not very well known, but it's not very well represented either. And while there were pilgrims, whom we all learn about somewhat, what we learn about them generally is that they gleefully sailed across the Atlantic, landed at Plymouth Rock, sat down with the Native Americans for a great Thanksgiving feast, and lived happily ever after, which is not true at all. And why are these clarifications important? Because they not only define why these people, of whom some of us are direct descendants, came here in the first place, but they also clarify why we're here at all. And if we listen to these lessons, they can remind us of who we are and who we may want to try to become. Well, folks, if I could pick one person to share the story of this long-standing rivalry between New York and Boston, I could do no better than the gentleman whom we are honored to host today, a man who will himself articulate along with me the finer points of, for instance, a letter scripted in Dutch and French in 1627 by the man who had just recently purchased the island of Manhattan from the native Algonquins and wrote it in effort to reach out to the next closest colony, the Plymouth colony, up near Cape Cod. And to what end? Well, to try to expand the profit centers of the Dutch West India Company, of course. His book is They Knew They Were Pilgrims, and few titles can help us tell this remarkable epic story better than it. So, damas and Aaron, mesdames et messieurs, damas y caballeros, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great reverence and esteem that I introduce Professor John G. Turner of George Mason University. Welcome, Mynheer.
Thanks. I'm pleased to be with you, but I have to sort of disappoint you and tell you that my wife's from Boston. I'm from Western New York, so I'm kind of straddling both sides of this rivalry.
I kind of knew you weren't from Boston, or I was assuming you weren't from Boston, but I'm glad your wife is from Boston. And by the way, it's all good fun. I have lots of friends and family in Boston, but a lot of people, I would venture to say most people, are just not that well versed on the specific religious distinction of this sect of people that came over here on the Mayflower in 1620. We all know, as I said, we all know this story of the Pilgrims to some extent, but even I started digging into the history. It took me a while to really wrap my hands around what made them distinct to themselves in this overall scope of Protestantism. Can you, as a professor and as a cradle to halfway to the grave Presbyterian straddling mainline and evangelical Protestantism, can you delineate that for us a little bit?
I can take a crack at it. And you're right. I think a lot of these finer distinctions they seem really foreign to Americans in the 21st century. I mean, even all the sort of denominational divisions among Protestants that used to be important to American Christians, they aren't really all that important today. So if you go back to the early 1600s and you sort of have all of these subspecies of Protestant reformers, it can get really confusing. And then I also think in grade school or even, middle or high school, Americans will learn these distinctions between pilgrims and Puritans, and they probably get some sense that Puritans are bad and pilgrims are better. And, I think it's all confusing and we need to get a little bit more into, what motivated these individuals. So, um, I think essentially the best starting point is to recognize that a lot of English Protestants were unhappy with their national church. They didn't think it had under Henry VIII and then Queen Elizabeth I, they didn't think it was sufficiently reformed. They thought it was still too Catholic. Some of them didn't like the fact that it was a church controlled by the state. That was also a point of complaint. But mainly they wanted to further purify it from things that seemed too Catholic, whether that was priestly garments, making the sign of the cross at baptism, sort of all the pageantry and kneeling in the Lord's Supper. They had a whole host of complaints. And so those people became known as Puritans for their desire to further purify the church. They wanted to get rid of anything that didn't seem biblical to them. Now, they couldn't necessarily agree on all of the finer points, all of the details, what was okay, what wasn't. And sort of the most extreme Puritans, or one group of extreme Puritans, became known as separatists. They totally rejected the Church of England. They thought it was a false church. They didn't want to reform it. They wanted to get rid of it and start over with their own small congregations formed by covenants among true Christians. And so that is the impulse that eventually gets us to the Mayflower.
Essentially, these separatists, the people who came over, the main religious group that came over on the Mayflower, because they weren't all separatists, but there were a few stragglers here and there.
Mhm.
There were some soldiers and some crew, but for the most part, this was William Brewster, um, William Bradford, and that flock
Mhm.
who were worshiping under John Robinson in Leiden, but Robinson never came over.
Correct.
He was their minister.
Yeah, they were, once they got here, by the way, that's a really important point. They were sort of sheep without a shepherd. They had a really hard time getting a full-time minister that they liked for a couple of decades. It was a huge problem for the colony. But yeah, that's absolutely right. And the thing that might be useful to know about these separatists is they were a really hated and loathed religious group in England in the late 1500s, early 1600s. Pretty much nobody liked them. So obviously the state church and its bishops and officials, crown officials, didn't like them because they understood them as seditious because they didn't accept the queen or king as the head of the church. And they executed a number of them in the late 1500s. Other Puritans also disliked them because they thought they were too extreme, and they gave somewhat more respectable Puritans a bad name. So Shakespeare, in one of his plays, he has this line that basically it's just about as bad to be a Brownist as a politician. Separatists were known as Brownists from this one reformer named Thomas Brown. So, if you're as bad as a politician, you're pretty bad.
And you had another quote in there about the Puritans What was the quote? It was great.
Yeah, it's basically a stereotype of the Puritans as people who love the Lord with all their heart and hate their neighbor just as much.
Yeah, something like
Um,
they were really insular people. They were really about getting over here and just insulating themselves, transporting this congregation to this new world.
well, I wouldn't say they're totally insular though, because one of their hopes was that, they're in Leiden for a while, and, it's somewhat difficult living. Not all of them are at the top of the economic ladder. And, they've been persecuted in England. And because of that, they don't have a lot of broad appeal. And they think that if they plant a colony that prospers, then that means also prospers economically. More of those Puritans who might have kept them at arm's length in England might give them sort of a second look or decide to join them. They don't want to be just this absolutely tiny church with no influence on the world. They actually want to become, you know, they sort of want to plant a seed that grows into something much bigger and greater.
Yeah, I guess, and I don't mean to criticize or denigrate what they were trying to do. I think all these Reformed Protestants, all these Calvinists were doing what they thought was right, and what they saw as the main malfunction with the Church of England, and prior to that, with the greater Holy Roman Empire, which is all the Church of England was the offshoot of that when Henry VIII wanted to get a legal divorce. So he split from the Church of England. I mean, he split Roman Catholicism, but it was essentially Henry VIII's version of Roman Catholicism. And that's, I
Right.
think, why they had the major issues with it, because it was essentially church and state was the same. And there
Right.
was no questioning it in any way.
Right. And, under Elizabeth and even under James, this sort of ebbs and flows, but sometimes there's a tolerance or like grudging acceptance of a limited amount of dissent, but that all rests on the pleasure of the crown. And, the Puritans and the Pilgrims, if you take a closer look at them, these are not a tolerant bunch in a modern sense, but they're also up against a really intolerant state-controlled religious system. And hardly anybody wants to have a free marketplace of religion in the late 1500s, early 1600s. Usually, most people have some sense of what a true church looks like, and they don't really want other options out there unless they think they just have to live with it, which is sort of the situation in the Dutch Republic.
You say when these pilgrims, these separatists came across, settled here in Plymouth, Mass, when they formed a government and made laws, pilgrim leaders could not envision and would not have favored democracy as later Americans would understand it. That's very interesting.
Hmm.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so democracy sort of was a dirty word in the 17th century. It was still a dirty word at the time of the American Revolution. And, a lot of the founding fathers, they want to distance themselves from that concept. Um, the Pilgrims, they get accused sometimes of being democratic. And John Robinson, their pastor back in Leiden, he in one of his writings, he sort of conceded the point that the government of their church was somewhat democratic. So this was sort of a dirty word. Um, Despite that, there is sort of a democratic germ, if you will, in the Mayflower Compact. Um, Partly just because of the particular circumstances, pretty much all of the men among the Mayflower passengers become a member of what they call the body politic. the group of people who can elect officers and approve laws in Plymouth. And I do actually think that is sort of democratic and radical for the time. And they have an annual election for a governor, which is also kind of a radical idea at the time. As the colony progresses and gets a little bit bigger, it becomes less and less democratic as the years pass. Not a very high percentage of men um, have the right to vote. And it's usually sort of a small cadre of leaders who are sort of calling the shots most of the time.
You mentioned Leiden, that the Pilgrims, these people, these separatists who started in London, left London in, I think, 1609 or thereabouts, John Robinson and his flock. And they first went to Scrooby, correct?
Well, so they come from a number of places in England. Scrooby and Gainsborough are the most famous, and there's one or two covenanted congregations of these separatists there. But they're scattered here and there elsewhere. So, there's a town on the coast in the south of England called Sandwich. A number of them come from there. And it's sort of a time of renewed persecution of separatists around 1606, 1607, and they sort of in groups or sometimes as individuals, they make their way first to Amsterdam and then Leiden. And so a lot of them are there for about a dozen years. And by around 1617, they're starting to think seriously about leaving. I think there's a few reasons for that. They nothing, I don't know what they had against Dutch, but they didn't want to all become Dutch. They wanted to stay English. They wanted their children to grow up both English and within their church. There was a lot of political tumult in the Dutch Republic at the time. I think that also contributed. And at the same time, it's actually interesting. I think most people don't know this. Most of them were very hesitant to leave. About a third of the congregation ultimately um, crosses the Atlantic. Some of them don't have the money to do that, but I think most of them, they know starting a colony, it's kind of a foolish thing to do, really difficult, high likelihood of death. So a lot of them stay behind and do eventually sort of blend into, Dutch Reformed society.
And that actually plays into your title for the book. They knew they were pilgrims. It's from the Bible, and it had to do with allaying the fear that they had, and disregarding the concerns they had for their welfare. I mean, they were essentially going. It was almost like going to the moon today to form a colony based
Yeah.
on technology and the abilities of these humans to go off into the wilderness. And they did it because they knew they were pilgrims.
Yeah, so it's a phrase from the New Testament. And these people didn't think of themselves as the pilgrims. That they didn't start getting called that really until the early 1800s. But they were essentially having this tearful parting with the people in their congregation who weren't joining them on the venture. And William Bradford reflects, we really don't know what's going to happen to us on Earth. We might get killed. We don't know exactly where our ships are going to land. We don't know what's going to happen. But we know we're pilgrims in the sense of Christians on a pilgrimage that ultimately leads to heaven. So we don't know what's going to happen to us on Earth, but we can essentially deal with it because we have confidence in our eternal destination. So it's sort of an idea just that faith is going to sustain them no matter what the earthly travails are. And you're totally right. I mean, these people knew the first group of colonists going everywhere, it's almost certainly going to be a disaster. They knew what had happened in Jamestown. There are other disasters they're aware of. And so it's a really high likelihood that the first group is going to have a rough time.
Yeah, and again, they had to keep their goals and their objectives fairly focused, and it's no knock on their pursuit, that they had to survive and they
Right.
had to do what they initially set out to do. And you say in the book, the Leiden Pilgrims came to the New World to establish a haven for separatism, not a bastion of religious toleration and freedom. Their goal was to transplant a congregation, found a prosperous colony, and attract Puritans wavering on the threshold of separatism to join them. Then, a little bit later on, you said the Pilgrims were determined to keep New Plymouth's church and government in their own hands. They preserve their own liberty by denying it to others.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's sort of the school idea. The Pilgrims came to Plymouth for religious liberty, which is true. But as, those quotes point to, they came for their understanding of Christian liberty, which was really specific and narrow. It was the liberty to have church in the way they understood it according to the Bible, not to have some free-for-all, free marketplace of religion. And so that's what they came for. They wanted their own liberty of conscience. And they didn't, now in keeping with their vision of the church, they weren't going to make anybody else join their church. They wouldn't even have accepted most people. They weren't going to make other people get their children baptized. Most of the time, they didn't even make other people attend church, but they didn't want multiple religious options in their colony. And, there's a few flashpoints as the colony develops where they really try to stamp out dissent. And, those are some of the fault lines that I think make sort of the history of these colonies in the 17th century really, really fascinating.
I agree with you. History in general, to I would say to most people, is initially has a stereotype of being boring, dusty, nebulous. It's you got to read. Kids don't read today, but I've always looked at it through the lens of characters, through the eyes of characters, and I think it's really critical that in your book does it very well, where you really get into the characters of Bradford and Brewster and the family, the offspring of these people, and people like Isaac Allerton, who was one of my favorites. The characters really start to make the story interesting. I think the characters define the history very much for me. And like for instance, in the Dutch story, one of the first permanent settlers in New Netherland was a Walloon by the name of Joris Rapalia. And he came over at 19 years old with his Parisian wife who was 18. I mean, I have kids who are 23. I can't imagine them going across the ocean to found a colony. But Bradford himself wasn't much older than that when he came over, was he?
Now, you can find people like John Alden, who's another one of the famous Mayflower pilgrims. He's super young. He's still in his teens on the Mayflower, and he dies at the age of 88. He almost makes it. He almost lives the colony's whole 70 years of existence. He doesn't quite make it. I think he dies in 1686 or something like that. But not only, in the Pilgrim case, not only do a lot of these people come over very young, a lot of them live a long time. So Bradford is on the scene and more or less in charge of the colony through the 1650s. So, these people, they show up and they're pretty sturdy. I mean, even someone like William Brewster, who's the elder in the congregation and really their foremost preacher for the first 25 years of the colony. That's a long time to be on the scene. John Winthrop's another good example of that in Massachusetts Bay. I mean, he's sort of more or less in charge for about 20 years, but that's a long time too. If you look at the history of a lot of somewhere like Jamestown, you got leaders coming and going all the time. Plymouth had a lot of stability.
Yeah, whatever the Plymouth Pilgrims missed in terms of transporting the English monarchy to the States, Winthrop and his son did their best to follow it up, but they're very pivotal to this overall epic story. Let's go back to Isaac Allerton a little bit. he's interesting to me because he's one of the first cast-offs that lands by default, by attrition in Manhattan.
Yeah.
What happened? What was the major malfunction with Allerton as far as the Puritans were concerned?
So yeah, Allerton, he is a fascinating character. So I think he's grows up, he's a tailor in England.
Mhm.
Then he ends up a member of John Robinson's congregation in Leyden. He when he gets to Plymouth, his first wife dies almost immediately.
Right.
Almost half of the Mayflower passengers die the first winter. He then marries William Brewster's daughter.
Yeah.
So, he's very much at the center of the colony's leadership. He's elected as an assistant magistrate to William Bradford. And then he starts going back and forth to London and forms a connection with some of the colony's financial backers. Basically, they need to find a way to make New Plymouth work financially, and they have a number of arrangements that ultimately hinge on their ability to control the New England fur trade. Allerton, though, he doesn't just devote him to the colony's cause. He starts pursuing his own trading opportunities alongside those of his pilgrim partners. And Bradford, I mean, he is unstinting in his criticism of Allerton in his history of the colony. He says basically, Allerton's playing his own game. He makes it very clear he regards this as sinful and selfish. And I think it's shortly after Allerton's second wife dies, if I'm not mistaken. He really detaches himself from New Plymouth. He goes to Massachusetts Bay. Then he sort of goes back and forth between New Haven and New Amsterdam. I'm, I don't know that much about his later activities, but he does pretty well, I think. He's still successful as a merchant and trader and can sort of remake his life out of the colony. So I think he found sort of the colony's financial arrangements too restrictive. And his partners, they want to make the colony thrive and attract other people to their religious vision. I don't know how Allerton ends up really thinking about that, but he clearly wants to chart his own course.
I love the way he sort of signs on to this voyage, comes across, and they sort of notice, hey, this guy's kind of a wheeler dealer type. Let's send him back. They nominate him to go back and renegotiate with the Virginia Company to find a way for them to wrest control of the ownership of the colony after 7 years, I believe.
Hmm.
He goes back and does what, as I see it, he does what he has to do and he gets it done. Then they start criticizing him up and down about how he did it. Yet they're the Puritans who won't leave Plymouth and they send him to go do their bidding. And then they argue about it when he comes back and has succeeded in doing it. Ultimately, he was a wheeler dealer, he was a businessman. And they cast him out because
Yeah.
he was not pure and Puritan enough. It's almost as if he always belonged on Manhattan Island because while they were pilgrims, in my own view, they had more than just one God.
All
They
right.
had at least two gods, and one of them was the Dutch West India Company board of directors.
Yeah. So I mean it's interesting. There's another Mayflower passenger named Edward Winslow, and he's, in a similar way, he's at least as cosmopolitan as Allerton. He's also a pretty shrewd um, businessman, um, very successful in terms of he has a little bit more wealth, I think, when he first joins this venture, and he does rather well for himself in New Plymouth. He also spends a lot of time back in London. I think both he and Allerton, I mean, Allerton was a member of the congregation Enlightened, so he had been a separatist. But I think, they're not all a bunch of rubes, right? They have some really talented men. And I think some of them, they feel a tug between this little colony that Bradford really wants them to focus on, this tightly knit colony in Plymouth. Bradford doesn't even like it when people disperse to form other towns in the colony. But, and then you have these men that, like Winslow and Allerton, they have this broader view of the world. They're comfortable, crossing the Atlantic, going to different colonies. Winslow, nevertheless, remains a little bit more rooted and attached to the colony. Allerton, I think, he just realizes, look, I'm not going to be able to pursue my own opportunities. These people are going to hold me back. And once he doesn't have the family connection tying him to the colony, I think he's just out of there. The other thing Allerton does, is he does something that just seems inexplicable in 1629. So there was this sort of roguish scoundrel named Thomas Morden, who, his is another really long story. You could definitely fill multiple podcast episodes just on him. But essentially, he had founded his own trading outpost on the rim of Massachusetts Bay. And the Pilgrims understood that as a serious threat to their own prosperity, because Morden was sort of jousting with them for access to the best sources of furs. And so they basically ransack his outpost and they send him back to England. Allerton brings Thomas Morden back across the Atlantic, is in his employ as a scribe in 1629. And I'm sure from the moment he did that, Bradford, sized this guy up as, okay, he's sort of gone over to the dark side. And, if you're willing to associate with this person that we really regard as immoral and as an economic threat to us, you're not really on the Lord's side anymore.
Yeah, once you start down that path of the dark, evil throes of capitalism, sometimes they never come back, John, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Great. Listen, tell us what else is going on. Any other titles you're working on? Any other events that you want to let us know about?
Well, I'm not working on anything pertaining to early New England, but I'm working on a biography of another son of New England, Joseph Smith, the Mormon Latter-day
Oh,
Saint
yeah.
prophet.
Oh, very
So
interesting.
hopefully that book will be out next year.
Fabulous. Good luck with that. And tell us you have a website that all this information is on, all your titles and everything that you do is there. Can you let everybody know your website?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. johngturner.com.
johngturner.com. Well, Professor John G. Turner, your remarkable detail and perspective in telling this fascinating story is clearly driven by a passion that I share and that I so greatly admire. There's something sacred about not just imparting this remarkable story unto others, but in doing it in a way that is untarnished by any bias, and in telling it in a way that makes people want to listen, especially people today, because this story in so many ways is who we are. And if we listen very closely to it, it can help to guide us. Because in the immortal words of the great Thomas Paine, the cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind. And I really believe that. You and I are officially co-conspirators in a holy pursuit of making history cool. Your book is timeless and momentous, and I commend you on it. And I thank you tremendously for taking the time to share your priceless time, spirit, and insight with us. And we look forward to following your career as it moves forward. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be with you.
Okay, sir. Thank you for coming on. We'll talk to you soon. The book is They Knew They Were Pilgrims by author John G. Turner. Available at all major booksellers and on his website at johngturner.com. If you're enjoying us on YouTube, please be sure to hit the subscribe button to get every episode. And don't forget to tune in to our companion podcast, Island, the incredible history of the island of Manhattan from 1609 to 1909. History is cool. Island Voices is a production of Chance Kelly, Inc. and may not be reproduced or re-exhibited in any manner in whole or in part without authorization. Thank you.